Ahoy! Attribute perks in New World are weird. Some of them are extremely strong and almost or completely mandatory, while others are fairly weak or don't work at all. Let's take a closer look at the perks that are available and classify them as well. There are going to be 5 tiers: perks that don't work, bad perks, average perks, good perks, and perks that are extremely good to the point that some of them may even need nerfs. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that in the next days I'll be doing a Q&A, so if you have any questions surrounding New World or anything else, feel free to drop them in the comments below. Our first attribute is Strength. The 50 Strength perk is 10% damage to melee physical basic attacks. This, I think, is a good perk. Not too much to say about it. It's fairly strong because it affects both light and heavy attacks. It doesn't affect your abilities, but overall it's most certainly very useful. The 100 Strength perk increases your slash and strike damage by 5%. I consider this a good perk too, since it affects both your light and heavy attacks as well as your abilities. The 150 Strength perk gives you plus 25% stamina damage from melee light basic attacks. This perk, in my opinion, is bad. This is because all other 150 attribute point perks are actually extremely good, and this one is just almost useless in comparison. Light attacks have a very weak stamina damage to begin with for the most part, so a 25% increase is not substantially going to change that. Most players in PvP are very rarely blocking in the first place, so this is primarily relevant as a PvE perk, and if you ever need to stam break something in PvE, you're most certainly going to use heavy attacks. It is, by the way, also pretty rough that, as far as I'm aware, all of the perks up until this point do not affect the blunderbuss at all, despite its scaling with strength. The 200 Strength perk increases your damage to stunned, slowed or rooted enemies by 10%. I would place this perk on the lower end of good. It is somewhat conditional, but at the same time a lot of melee weapons have decent access to slows, so you can relatively consistently apply this effect. What throws me off about it is that it doesn't apply to things like flatten or sweeps, anything that puts the enemy on the ground. Those are technically counted as staggers as far as I'm aware, and I guess for some reason they didn't want to include staggers because that may lead to some further problems, and so they didn't include those effects either. I really feel like those are hard CC effects and should just be included in any conditional effect like this. This is especially relevant for the spear in this context. The 250 Strength perk is supposed to provide you with faster stamina regeneration while performing basic attacks. However, it doesn't seem to work at all. I did an extensive test video about this. If you're interested, I will link this right here. And as far as I was able to find, it doesn't do anything at all. It also doesn't have anything assigned internally, and the devs are aware of this now, so hopefully this will actually be a usable effect in the future. The 300 Strength perk is without a doubt the strongest perk in the strength tree and arguably the best perk in the game. It provides all of your melee attacks with grit, and even those heavy attacks that already have grit get a longer period of grit because it already activates during the light attack phase of the heavy attack. Especially in larger fights where you get staggered a lot, this perk is almost mandatory. I personally believe that this perk makes strength builds way too static. All other attributes have very strong 150 point perks and often relatively weak 300 point perks. Strength is by far the biggest outlier to this and forces you to kind of commit deep into the tree in order to get this, even if you may want to mix the build up more in other ways. I personally don't like the playstyle that constant melee grid creates. I actually assumed that they would nerf this very early, but it seems like this is something they do prefer, at least so far. So I wouldn't even be mad if they just completely nerfed this perk, if they nerfed staggers that happen frequently from ranged attacks along with that, so that it would really be more of an even playing field for everyone where staggers and grit are just less prevalent. The problem is that this would require a pretty significant overhaul of game mechanics. Generally, I wish the 300 Strength perk wasn't as important as it is in order to allow more variety in builds. Now this is complicated to do because you can't just put the grit perk on 150 Strength, that would be insanely strong. But I don't know what the best solution here would be in order to keep it balanced compared to other trees, but also make the 150 points perk not so useless and force you so much into strength. Our next attribute is Dexterity. At 50 dex you get 10% crit chance, pretty plain and simple. I know that crit is not exactly that great at the moment because in PvE you will often be backstabbing anyways, and in PvP there is a lot of mitigation against crit, resilient and so on. So it's not perfect, but it's still a good perk to have overall because a lot of things proc off crit. Similarly, if you look at the 100 dex perk, you may be thinking, this is just 5% thrust damage while strength gets slash and strike damage, so technically this is weaker. But practically there are so many weapons and attacks that are thrust damage that it actually ends up being very strong anyways. The 150 dex perk is extremely strong. All dodges costing 10 less stamina has a massive impact on your playstyle, especially in light and in medium. Stamina management is just entirely different and much less present, and it allows you to create much more distance and also to iframe a lot more often. I personally believe that this perk is too strong, especially because many dex weapons already have very good mobility options or options to create distance in other ways. And this is true both for melee and ranged weapons that scale with dex. The 200 dex perk provides you with 10% bonus backstab and headshot damage. This is especially strong in PvE, where you can reliably do this, but even in PvP, both backstab and headshot damage have their benefits, especially when this is one of the ways you can actually get past the normal resilient 150 con cap of crit damage. Strangely, the next perk afterwards is actually worse. 250 dex provides you with 10% bonus random critical hit damage against stunned, slowed or rooted enemies. The only thing that kind of saved this is that slows are included here, otherwise it would be very rarely relevant at all. Depending on your weapon, this alone may not even get you through the resilient cap, so you may need to backstab with rogue and the backstab bonus on top of that for this to even be effective in PvP. I'd say this perk barely makes the average tier. And the same is true for the 300 dex perk, a guaranteed critical hit after a dodge, but can only happen once every 10 seconds. There are a few niche scenarios where this has some usefulness. I think especially muskets can benefit from this under certain circumstances, but overall it's just a very meh perk because crit in general, or random crit especially, is not that important. Also, the 10 seconds cooldown is very long. I'd still rate it as average when comparing it to other 300 point perks excluding strength. So these are my overall ratings for the dex perks, assuming they actually all work. The perks start out very strong but then kind of fall off at the top end, but overall I think it's a solid tree and the 150 points perk is insanely strong. Intelligence starts out with an absurdly strong perk. At 50 int you get 10% backstab damage and 10% random crit damage. That is basically the 200 and the 250 dex perk in one, and the 250 dex perk in this case wouldn't even rely on the enemy being CC'd. The only thing this doesn't apply to is headshots. This perk is insanely strong, especially on the rapier, and something tells me that whoever was making this perk kinda liked the rapier a lot. It's honestly really surprising to see this as a 50 points perk on int, because it heavily favors any weapon that can utilize both dex and int. If the daggers end up scaling with dex and int in the future, then I could imagine many mages suddenly not being that happy that this perk exists in this state. The 100 int perk is simply good, 10% damage to light and heavy magic attacks. Nothing insane, but definitely very much useful. But speaking of things that are insane, we have the 150 int perk, plus 15% elemental damage. That is crazy because it affects the vast majority of the damage output from any int user. It affects what's on your weapon itself, which may not be a fully int scaling weapon, it could be something with a gem like a blunderbuss for example, but then it still affects the portions of that are elemental. It affects your abilities, it affects additional effects like for example rune glass damage, so overall it's just a massive damage increase across the board. It is also especially strong for muskets because the elemental damage portion of their shots has no damage fall off, and that gets further multiplied by this. But after riding this high of 3 strong perks, the 200 int perk is quite the opposite. 10 mana after a dodge. Mana in New World is very rarely an issue, and when it is, you just chug a pot. We have to be fair here though, this perk existing is a major factor in that. I think other mana perks are much less effective than this one, which overall gives it some value, and I would put it on the low end of average. The 250 int perk provides us with plus 30% dot spell duration. I believe this is a good perk. There are sufficient dot spells out there to make this effective, though it obviously depends on your playstyle and build, it can be more or less effective. The same can't be said for the 300 int perk. This provides you with plus 10% damage on your first hit against a full health target. This is incredibly situational and can rarely really be used effectively. First of all, many fights in New World don't start with both enemies being completely full health, especially in modes like OPR or Wars. There's a lot of trickle damage going around. And then it can also be consumed by too many spells where it wouldn't really get that much effectiveness because they just deal low damage on their first hit or tick or whatever. So it's not exactly like you can just blast an ice spike into someone's face to get the max benefit out of this. Roger, who actually plays Mage, had an interesting suggestion on my Patreon Discord, saying that you could make 300 int work like Giant Slayer instead, where it affects the first 10% of the enemy's health instead of just a hit when they're at full health. He further suggested cutting the threshold down to 80% health because, let's face it, Giant Slayer isn't even used by anyone. This perk is so niche that generally I would definitely consider it to be a bad perk. Overall, we see a similar picture to the Dex tree here, where a lot of the more effective perks are very much front-loaded and towards the end it kind of fizzles out. Having a build with 200 Dex and 150 Int, the rest in Con, would be very effective, for example, because that's just a very strong combination of perks overall. Let's move over to Focus. The first perk here at 50 points is just 5% cooldown reduction. That is a good perk to have and especially useful for a healer, so definitely gets a good rating. The 100 Focus perk is again a perk that affects mana. In this case, it increases your mana pool by 20 points. Personally, I think an increased mana pool can be useful in quite a few situations when you quickly spam spells, for example, so it's not entirely without purpose, especially with a mana-hungry offhand like the Void Gauntlet as well. It also benefits perks like Radiant Efficiency that are based on your percentage mana. So generally this is not entirely without purpose, but also not particularly strong, and I would rate it as average. The 150 Focus perk simply increases your healing by 20%. That's just extremely strong for anyone intending to heal. I don't think we need to discuss this any further, this is pretty obvious. I don't think it necessarily needs nerfs though, but once again, I question the 150 points placement a little bit. At 200 Focus we have plus 20% casted buff duration, which is definitely solid for something like the Life Staff, which uses a lot of buffs. I would rate this as a good perk. The 250 Focus perk is plus 30 mana on any self or group AI kill. I have no idea why this exists, being the only PvE only perk in all trees. Really weird decision here. Don't know what that's supposed to be useful for. Definitely a bad perk in my opinion. There are other ways to get mana better. At 300 Focus we get 8 mana per second for 10 seconds if our mana goes below 15 points. This is a 60 seconds cooldown, and in my opinion it's just straight up a bad perk. It's basically a free but slowed down version of a mana pot once per minute, and it's also at the 300 points capstone, so it feels completely underwhelming. But we need to talk about the other amazing perk that you get at 300 Focus. 10% cooldown reduction for fast travel. That's crazy. Overall, the Focus tree looks somewhat similar to the Dex and Int tree, where the beginning is better than the end, which could potentially become interesting in context of the next weapon. We know that there's some sort of supportive weapon that we can expect next, and I would expect it to scale with Focus, but maybe it has a secondary scaling with Int, so basically the opposite of the Void Gauntlet. In that case, it would be very interesting to see how players spend their attribute points. Last but not least, we have Constitution. We're starting off average here with 20% healing from consumables at 50 points. Nothing crazy, nothing terrible, I would say in most situations. At 100 point, it increases our max health by 10% of our physical armor. This is a very weak perk. Generally, most loadouts in New World when going heavy don't even reach 2000 armor, so this is less than 200 extra health. In light and medium, it's somewhere between 70 to 130 extra health. But in return, the 150 con perk is extremely strong. With minus 10% critical damage taken, you get a very significant reduction against any critical attacks or backstabs coming your way, so this is a nice addition that basically gives you around 2 pieces of free resilient. This perk is why you very rarely see builds with less than 150 con in PvP. While this perk is very strong, I believe it's fair for this perk to be this good, and I don't think it should be deeper in the tree because then people would just have to commit too much con and there would not be enough build flexibility in general. The 200 con perk provides you with plus 10% physical and elemental armor, which is better than just getting that small number of health because it does affect your mitigations, which usually translates a little bit better, but overall I don't think it's as insane as some people make it out to be. I would rate this as a solid average. The 250 con perk gives you 60% damage reduction when at full health, which in itself is maybe somewhat interesting in a scenario where you're tanking and you're getting healed by someone, so you're more frequently at full health. But it has a 60 seconds cooldown and that pretty much makes it almost forgettable. This perk went from being one of the most broken perks in New World to being kind of an afterthought at this point. The 300 con perk gives you plus 20% duration of stun, slows and root spells. This is pretty good, I would say. I don't think it's insane, but especially in combination with the heavy armor perk that provides you with the same thing basically, this is definitely solid. The problem that I have with it is how inconsistent CC durations in general seem to be, and how this is not affecting certain bonus perks that increase CC duration as well. So it's kind of a hit or miss if this is actually particularly effective for the ability that you're using or not. And once again, it is annoying that it doesn't apply to knockdowns of any kind. Also, some CC in New World has capped durations, so this perk will not always be equally effective and sometimes only take effectiveness if your enemy has enough freedom to reduce the CC sufficiently so that you can counteract it with the increased CC duration. As a whole, the con tree definitely looks worse than other trees, but it's the only one that actually has a good 150 and 300 points capstone. But generally I think this one needs the most work. 300 con builds are very rare these days. If you haven't seen it yet, I recently made a video talking about alternative armor sets that may be interesting for you. I'll link that right here. And also again, I will be doing a Q&A, so if you want to submit any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. Sloth, out.